we're going to be looking at a story about David. This is the same David as we might remember from when we were over in FC Kids learning about David and Goliath. Same dude. Now, we're going to be picking up in David's life after he became a king. So this is after the David and Goliath story. So from now on, we're going to call him by his proper name, King David. King David was a godly man, and a lot of people would call him King David, the man after God's own heart. Now, not only was he tight with God, but as a king, he was the leader of the military. And he was young, but he was still very successful and very respected. So if you'd like to follow along with this story in your Bible, we're starting with 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. If you didn't bring your Bible, no big deal. I'll have it on the screen and we can follow along. But it says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab. He was the general of the armed forces, so he has a big shot in the army. Out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed their enemy. But notice this next part. But David remained in Jerusalem. And in doing so, David took his first step in a series of mistakes that will ultimately cost him respect as a leader of Israel and the leader of his family. And today I want us to pay really close attention to the pattern of David's fall. I think there's something inside of there for you and I if we look close enough. So David's first mistake is right here in verse 1. He wasn't where he was supposed to be. Or if we say it another way, he forgot his purpose. So did you notice the first part of the verse tells us that spring is the time that kings are in war with their army. So kings like David were supposed to be at war. What is he doing at home? He should be out with his troops, fighting to expand his kingdom. He apparently forgot his purpose as a king. He lost focus on his dreams, which were to make Israel a great nation. This is where the problem began in verse 1, where David stayed behind in Jerusalem. He abandoned his purpose, and he wasn't where he was supposed to be. So let's continue on. It says, one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around the roof of the palace. So this is normal back in the day, especially on a good spring day. What they would do is they would get out, they go up on their roof. This is equivalent to like your balcony or your deck. It was just hanging out, just chilling. It tells us that he was restless, and his next mistake is implied in the next phrase. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. Uh-oh. In that region still today, it's completely wrong to be looking over the walls of a building. Their walls are basically like their security system. The one you type the little code in, that's their security system. So basically, in modern day terms, what he's doing is he's going to the neighbor's house. He's looking in the window while the woman is bathing. And sure enough, he saw something that he wouldn't have seen if he was looking where he was supposed to look. He saw a woman bathing. And the Bible tells us that the woman was very beautiful. So he could have stopped there, right? But he makes more bad choices. In verse 3, it says, David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, and the wife of Uriah. So basically, translated into proper in current terms, what he's doing right here is he's creeping on Instagram. He sees the girl that he likes, and he wants to get on her page to see if she's available, if she has any baggage, and if all of her pictures are pretty. That's what he's doing right here. So you might be saying, well, he hasn't done anything wrong. David hasn't done really anything wrong. And in our culture today, you're right. He technically hasn't done anything wrong. I mean, he hasn't made a move. He just happened to look over. But as a Christian, we're focused on something that is completely different. God warns us to avoid temptation. Temptation is a fancy word that not many people outside of the Christian world really ever focus on. It's a struggle that not many people focus on. So me personally, I'm like, I feel a lot of humans where I need to know why. If someone tells me to do something, I want to know why they tell me to do that. So let's ask a question in this story. God tells us to avoid temptation. Why? Let's turn back to David to see if we can get a why. But real quick, let's recap. David began his problem by forgetting his purpose and not being where he was supposed to be. In this next verse, David makes his second mistake. When temptation came, he looked into it instead of turning away from it. He didn't avoid the situation or shut it down. He clicked on the link of the racy picture of the woman. He checked out that website with videos on it that we know we're not supposed to look at. The book of James warns us about this same progression in James 1, verses 14 and 15. But each one is tempted when, by his own desire, he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. It starts with letting desire get out of control. There's a man named Martin Luther. He was a really important Christian back in the 1500s. He was a professor as well. He says it this way: you can't keep the birds from flying over your head, but you can keep them from nesting in your hair. So basically, he's saying we can't stop thoughts of temptation from flying over our heads, but we are able to stop them from nesting in our minds. So our thoughts about other people from the opposite sex going to be in our mind. Yeah, it happens to me. It happens to you. The question is not whether or not those thoughts will come. It's what we do with them that matters. We can choose to move on to more wholesome thoughts, or we can dwell on them and let them dive deeper into sin, as unfortunately we see David does. 3, he lets sin take over. He actually engineers a plan to sin. It says, then David sent messengers to get Bathsheba. And the text next says, she came to him and he slept with her. Not much detail. A lot is left to our imagination, but we do know that David let sin completely take over in this situation. He gave up his battle completely. He knew that what he was doing was as wrong as it can be, but he intentionally chose to say, I'm going to do it anyways. So now he had to take a fourth step. He tried to cover up his sin by deceiving everybody. The text tells us, then Bathsheba went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. Now David's sweating bullets. But let's pause for a moment and look at this from a different perspective. Bathsheba never really gets looked at in this story. It's always David did this, David did this, David did this. Now Bathsheba was a married woman. We read that earlier in the text. Why would she ever leave her home and go to David's? Was it his power and fame of being a king? Doesn't this happen all the time now? The popular boy at school feels like he has the rights to every girl. The best athlete at school seems to have the best selection of girlfriends. We need to look past that. We need to be careful about being drawn to that. Ladies, that guy's heart towards Jesus is much more attractive than any other characteristic he has. It's more important than any three-pointer he makes or how perfect his hair is. It's about his heart towards Jesus. Now let's pick up in this story again. The offense that Bathsheba and David had committed in this time was punishable in Old Testament law by death, by stoning. And besides that, he's the leader of all of Israel, and he's in a big mess. Not to mention all of his personal problems that this is going to cause him and his family. I encourage you to read the rest of this story. His consequences of sin became far-reaching, and neither David nor his family or Israel were ever the same for a long time after this happened. David had the choice to turn away from this sin at any point along the way. But notice, once it got started, it was difficult for him to stop. And if it was true of David, it's true for us too. And the reality of this story is incredibly scary because remember, King David was described as the man after God's own heart. If he fell into temptation, how do we consider ourselves immune? But there's hope. The beauty of our religion is that God gives us guardrails. Guardrails that are given to us, not that we can't have anything fun or that we can carry around a bunch of rules, but guardrails that are given to us for us to have a better life. We're in middle school and high school right now. We know what's going on around us. We hear rumors of what our classmates are doing with their girlfriends and boyfriends. We know what's going on at parties. We know what we can look at on the internet. We know how certain things can be put into our body to make us feel different for a short period of time. But you see, our God is warning us at the first step. He wants us to understand what temptation is and how to sense it well before we're on the rooftop staring right down at it. And he gives us written examples of what happens when we let that temptation get past the first step and into a stage where we can't stop it. The way that our human body is wired is to have two different compartments. We have the evil, the angel, and the devil. Think about like when we were watching cartoons back in the day, you'd have the angel on one side and the devil on the other. So think of it this way. The devil is our flesh, and the angel is our soul. He knows that our flesh is weak. He knows that our flesh is often too weak to resist going too far with our girlfriend or boyfriend when we're sitting at home alone under a blanket watching a movie. So stop that temptation completely and avoid that situation. Invite friends over when you know that you could be in that situation. Without this boundary, we can be in the same boat as David. We can make the same mistake that David did. He knows that our flesh is often too weak to resist that drink at the party when all of our other friends seem to be enjoying it. So stop the temptation well before it gets to that point and bring a friend that you can count on to hold you accountable to not drink. That drink or drug that you have at that party could make our flesh even weaker, and that can cause us to fall deeper into temptation and make a decision that we will regret our entire life. He knows that our flesh is often too weak to prevent ourselves from visiting that website full of videos that we know are so wrong, so we hide it. So avoid that temptation completely and find someone that you can trust to hold you accountable. Or maybe avoid taking your iPad or your phone into your room at night. Now understand, none of this is easy. Our world is actually against us in this fight. There are so many things that surround us that will feed into our temptation, and we can't win this battle alone. But again, we have hope. So look around. We have support. We have people on our team. We have Jesus and the wisdom inside of the Bible and through prayer. We have our small group leaders. We have friends, pastors, parents, coaches, and many other people to help us with this fight. We all share the unfortunate reality of a weak flesh. I'm no different. That's why Nick and I, or my friend Nick and I, have decided to fight this together. It doesn't make it easier for either one of us, but we can be open and honest with each other and share our struggles and successes. My prayer for us and as a church and as a student ministry is that we are able to find and share our struggles and successes with each other. That each of us are able to find a person or people that we can join together and fight with. One of my closest friends has created something with his small group that is just amazing to see. He has formed a relationship with his boys that is just absolutely amazing. And each of his students are going to be able to leave this student ministry with relationships in their lives that people search their entire lives for. One of my favorite books that I've ever read, and it was incredibly impactful in my life, was actually written by a famous duck commander, Jace Robinson. You guys might know him as the Duck Dynasty guys with the long beard. And I'm not inspired of this book because of how amazing his beard is, and I hope that mine is like that one day. But I'm inspired by how open and honest he is with sharing his struggles with temptation. In high school, Jace was a popular star athlete. He was attractive and cool. He had a girlfriend and a well-known successful family. And you might say, wow, I wish I was him. But looking back on it, he will tell you that because of all of that, he was thrown a lot more temptation in his life than he felt like he could handle. So let me read a bit about his story about how he fought temptation. He tells us, "My life was really about trying to avoid doing things that were wrong. As some of my friends began to experiment with sex, drugs, and alcohol, I simply tried to survive as a Christian. I remember a summer night after my baptism at a camp out with my buddies, and it became very uncomfortable. We camped out before, but on this night, 2 of the guys brought a couple of beers, a huge marijuana joint, and some nude magazines. I took a stand, and I told them I wouldn't be participating in any of these extracurricular activities that were planned. Fortunately, everyone agreed not to as well. However, that became my last camp out with those guys, as I was never invited back again. Sure, I had other opportunities to get into trouble with temptations of alcohol, drugs, and sex, but I decided that those weren't things that I was going to experiment with." He also tells us that his parents have always been very vocal about the birds and the bees. And he said the timing of their conversation was perfect in a time that he really needed to fight to stay sexually pure. He tells us a story of the previous year. I had really taken an interest in the opposite sex, and it all seemed pretty natural, but it all changed one night when I was in 9th grade. I went with a group of buddies to a swimming party where we met 2 girls who we were both very interested in. As the night wore on, we found ourselves alone in a room with the girls. The girl I liked asked me to help her undress. I was very attracted to her. As I looked back, my buddies were cheering me on, and the only thing I can think of was the word that my dad told me: run. I ran out of that room, and the abuse I took from my buddies over the next few days was probably the worst I've ever experienced. From then on, I decided to stay away from girls with questionable reputations and focus only on those who could possibly help me spiritually. I didn't feel I was strong enough to stay pure unless both parties had the same goal. I eventually came up with a plan of action. On the first date, I would share my faith with the girl and declare my intentions to wait until marriage before having sex. It was a way that held me accountable. By reading this, I guess he understood David's mistake. He stayed where he was supposed to be, and he avoided situations that he knew would lead into temptation. But again, my question is why? His buddies were cheering him on for what they thought would be the night of his life. What did he benefit from avoiding these situations? How did he benefit from running and facing all of this ridicule? Let's skip along a few years in his life to answer that why. To the point in his life where he was marrying his wife. To give a little bit of context to where we are in this story, he's standing at the altar getting ready to marry his wife, Missy. It tells us Missy and I have not seen each other much in the previous couple months because we couldn't keep our hands off each other. Many times we had to remind each other of our commitment to stay pure and had to have many prayers together. We were not perfect, but one of us would always stop things from getting too heated. Eventually, we decided to only have a long-distance relationship near the end and only have face-to-face encounters in public in church. As our wedding was approaching, we were both very excited because we had decided to save ourselves for marriage. This is why Christ is preparing us. You guys are happy about this story. You guys are smiling about this story because it's not about a human running around trying to fix a bunch of mistakes that he made. God wants us to have a story like this. His life is better because he didn't have to fix a drug problem before talking to his wife, Missy. He married the girl of his dreams because he didn't have to explain to her about the girl at the party in 9th grade. His family is better because he didn't have to fight off a porn addiction that started at a campfire in high school. But most importantly, he has a tight relationship with God because he understood that temptation is out there and it's waiting for us. Our life will be better and more pleasing to God if we fight temptation. If we avoid the rooftop, if we avoid the banter from people that don't understand, if we avoid the guys and the girls that give us a hard time because they don't respect our decision to wait, I'm not going to say it's easy. And if we fail, or if we've already failed, the good news is that God is still here with his arms wide open, ready for us to run to him for salvation, forgiveness, and guidance. And it's a perfect thing. It's easy for us to give in just like it was for David. Our flesh is weak. So let's prepare our souls for a fight.